If you have ever worried that feeling afraid, angry, or deeply sad could interfere with your healing, this episode will explain why feeling those emotions deeply might actually be helping you heal. In this episode, you'll learn the difference between allowing yourself to feel a difficult emotion and becoming stuck in it, what happens inside the body when we continually suppress what we feel, and what research involving people with cancer and other serious stress has found when people learn to approach difficult emotions with greater acceptance. I'll walk you through a practical process for allowing difficult emotions to move through you without giving them control of your entire day. This is part 2 of our 2-part series on positive emotions and healing. In the last episode, we talked about intentionally bringing more joy into your life. Today, we're going to talk about what to do with everything that does not feel joyful. Let's begin our conversation today with Dee's story, as shared in the book Radical Hope by Kelly A. Turner. In August of 2003, at only 31 years old, Dee was diagnosed with an aggressive HER2-positive breast cancer. Her doctors recommended a radical mastectomy, followed by chemotherapy and radiation, and the treatment was grueling. She completed 6 rounds of chemotherapy that were so hard on her body that even her oncologist later admitted he had wondered whether she would survive them. Radiation came next, every day for 6 weeks. Unlike chemotherapy, when someone had generally accompanied her to treatment, the daily schedule of radiation required that Dee often go alone. As the weeks continued, her energy declined and so did her mood. By the time the treatment ended, she was physically depleted, and her radiology team warned her that depression was common among the weeks that followed. But Dee decided that if depression was coming, she was not going to spend her days running from it. She would wake up in the morning almost daring the difficult emotions to show themselves. If sadness was there, she wanted to know what was underneath it. If anger surfaced, she wanted to understand it rather than immediately push it away. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" she began asking different questions. Why not me? What can I learn from this? What do I want my life to look if I can come through this? That process became Dee's first real lesson in positivity. She discovered that being positive did not mean refusing to enter sadness. In fact, she came to believe that the opposite was true. If her only goal was to feel happy, she might spend her life avoiding anything painful. But if her goal was to be present, honest, and continue growing, then she could allow herself to move into sadness or anger, understand what was there, and then eventually move back out of it again. For Dee, genuine happiness became something that emerged after difficult emotions had been acknowledged rather than something she had to paste over the top of them. She describes this as one of life's paradoxes. By allowing herself to feel sadness, she found greater access to joy. By facing what frightened her rather than continually fleeing from it, she felt more free to live. Dee came to believe that this emotional work was one of the most important pieces of her healing journey, and her cancer remained in remission for 7 years. Reaching 5 years carried particular meaning because her oncologist had not been confident that she would live that long, and Dee used those 5 years well. She traveled extensively, ended a relationship that no longer felt right for her, bought her first home on her own, and trained towards getting a black belt in karate, which was a lifelong goal. What began as a frightening period of illness became a time of significant personal growth. 6 years into her remission, she met the man who would later become her husband. Then, in February of 2010, at the age of 38, shortly after becoming engaged, Dee received the news she had hoped never to hear. The cancer was back. A biopsy confirmed that her breast cancer had spread to her lungs. There was significant disease in both lungs, and her entire left lung had collapsed. This time, when Dee sat across from an oncologist discussing her future, everything she had learned about fear, positivity, presence, and uncertainty during her first cancer experience was about to be tested at an entirely different level. Her oncologist told her he believed she had approximately 12 months to live and a 0% chance of surviving 18 months. Dee acknowledged that number. Then, privately, she decided she would aim for 5 years. Her doctors offered palliative chemotherapy. Dee chose not to pursue it. She had already been through enough, and knowing that she potentially only had 365 days left, she wanted to make the most out of every single one of those days. So she returned to meditation and asked what she needed to do with whatever time she had. The guidance she felt was remarkably simple. Be happy, go natural, and be grateful. Now, there was a bit of a problem with the first instruction, be happy. Dee had stage 4 cancer, 1 collapsed lung, and a physician telling her she might only have a year left. Some days she was angry, some days she wanted to cry, some days she wanted to stay beneath the covers and have nothing to do with the rest of the world. So for her, being happy became something different. It became being present. If she was angry, she allowed herself to recognize and feel the anger. If she needed to cry, she cried. If she needed a quiet day alone, she gave herself that day. She stopped measuring positivity by how successfully she could avoid uncomfortable emotions and began measuring it by how honestly she could live through whatever was actually there and then move on. Eventually, Dee realized there was one emotion she had not truly faced. She was afraid to die. That fear had become what she described as a dark cloud hanging over her. So rather than continuing to keep it at a distance, she took a day away from work and deliberately turned towards it. She allowed herself to contemplate the reality that one day she would die. Maybe cancer would be the reason, and maybe it would not. But death was part of being alive, whether she spent each day fearing it or not. Afterwards, something shifted for her. Death became something like a friend to her, and the awareness that she would someday die became a reminder to experience with gratitude the day she actually had left. Dee developed a metaphor for the emotional work she was doing. She thought of positivity as a garden. Joy, peace, gratitude, hope, and love were the flowers she wanted to grow. But she could not expect a healthy garden if she continually ignored the weeds underneath it. For her, those weeds included fear, anger, old hurts, grief, and unresolved experiences from her past. She began looking at the emotional reactions she was still carrying. She wrote letters to people who had hurt her, but did not send them because her goal was not to make those people understand or apologize. It was to make peace within herself. She used breathing and meditation to continue facing emotions rather than running from them. Though already a healthy eater, Dee also made some improvements to the way she ate, worked with a medical herbalist on a personalized supplement program, continued meditating, and remained physically active as much as her body allowed. She kept working and continued practicing karate twice a week, but she adapted it to her condition, focusing on kata rather than physical contact, and resting between sequences whenever she needed to. Just as importantly, she made a conscious decision that healing was not going to become another full-time source of stress. Rather than filling every day with treatments, appointments, and endless research about terminal cancer, Dee limited herself to roughly 1 wellness appointment each week. The rest of her time was for living. She read about healing, spirituality, and remarkable recoveries. She surrounded herself with a carefully chosen group of people she trusted, especially because she knew how strongly she could be affected by other people's fear. She focused on becoming a little stronger and healthier than she had been the day before. She figured if someone else could heal miraculously, then she at least could reduce a few symptoms. This showed up beautifully in the way she related to her body. Though she was down to only about 25% lung function, she deliberately focused on the portion that was still working and thanked it for keeping her alive. She appreciated her legs for carrying her, her feet for being strong beneath her, and her eyes for continuing to work. Instead of spending every waking moment criticizing the parts of her body that were sick, she began noticing how much of her body was still working extraordinarily hard on her behalf. That gratitude changed the relationship from which she approached her health, and gradually, Dee passed the 12-month mark. Then she approached 18 months, the point her oncologist had told her she had no chance of reaching. But instead of getting weaker, Dee felt increasingly well. Her husband noticed it too. At one point, he asked her what she wanted to do with the rest of their lives, and Dee realized there was something she had wanted for years. She wanted a child. Dee and her husband understood that there were enormous uncertainties involved, including the possibility that he could someday be left to raise their child alone, which he was willing to accept. But Dee also trusted how strong she felt and decided she wanted to move forward. And 3 weeks before her 40th birthday, Dee gave birth to a baby boy. Less than 2 years earlier, she had been sitting in an oncologist's office hearing that she had approximately 12 months to live and no chance of reaching 18 months. Now, she was holding her newborn son. Dee had purposefully not been receiving any follow-up scans during this period. Instead, she remained focused on how she felt, on raising her child, and on continuing the practices that had become part of her life. Eventually, another goal brought her back to medical imaging, though. Dee wanted to test for her second black belt in karate. Before asking her body to take on something that demanding, she decided she needed to know what was happening inside of her lungs to be safe. So she returned for a CT scan, and the result left her oncologist stunned. There was no evidence of disease. The extensive metastatic breast cancer that had involved both lungs, including the disease associated with the collapse of her left lung, was no longer visible on the scan. Now, we cannot look back through her story and identify one thing that made the cancer disappear. Dee changed her nutrition, she used supplements, she meditated, she exercised, she worked with practitioners, she surrounded herself with supportive people, and she made a number of deeply personal choices about her care. But when Dee herself reflects on her healing, the emotional work remains central to the way she understands what happened. She did not create positivity by refusing to acknowledge everything that frightened or hurt her. She faced those emotions directly, sometimes very deliberately, and then allowed herself to return to gratitude, hope, joy, and the life that was still in front of her. After the last episode, you might understandably come away thinking, if joy, laughter, gratitude, and positive emotions can influence physiology, should I be trying to stay positive as much as possible? And the answer is yes and no. I would be careful with that kind of a conclusion. Emotional freedom does not mean never becoming frightened, angry, sad, discouraged, or overwhelmed. If you have a terminal illness and you are frightened, your fear makes sense. If illness has taken away your independence, career, mobility, future plans, or sense of who you were, there may be real grief associated with those losses. If a doctor dismissed you, insurance denied care you needed, or someone you trusted abandoned you during the hardest period of your life, anger would be an entirely reasonable response. So emotional freedom means you experience that emotion without either suppressing it or becoming permanently trapped inside of it. The goal is to let emotions fill you and then flow out of you, much like water bubbling up from a spring that cascades out and into a flowing waterfall. Suppressing an emotion is different from regulating it. The more important question is what happens next. Do you recognize the emotion, understand what triggered it, respond to what needs responding to, and eventually begin returning towards baseline? Or do you try to force that emotion underground? Researchers have been studying the physiological effects of emotional suppression for decades, and one particularly interesting experiment involved 180 women who were randomly divided into two groups. Each woman watched several short films designed to produce different emotional responses. One was a comedy routine intended to create amusement. Another showed a distraught mother at a funeral and was intended to evoke sadness. And a third was emotionally neutral. Throughout the experiment, researchers recorded facial expressions and body movement while also continuously measuring heart activity, skin conductance, finger temperature, blood flow-related measures, breathing, and other indicators of autonomic activity. Half of the women were simply told to watch the films. The other half received a very specific instruction. If they felt anything while watching, they needed to try not to let it show. They were asked to behave in such a way that someone watching them would not be able to tell that they were feeling anything at all. Something interesting happened before the emotional films even started. Simply preparing to suppress their reactions produced greater physiological stress. Compared with the women who were going to watch normally, the suppression group showed faster heart rates, higher skin conductance, greater sympathetic cardiovascular activation, and greater respiratory activation while they were waiting for the film to begin. It was as if the body was already bracing for the effort of keeping that emotion contained. Then the films began, and the women proved remarkably good at hiding what they felt. To an observer, the suppression was working, but internally, something different was happening. When the women suppressed their responses to the emotional films, researchers found greater activation of the sympathetic cardiovascular system, the branch of the nervous system involved in mobilizing the body for danger. Interestingly, this did not occur during the neutral film. When there was very little emotion to suppress, simply controlling outward behavior did not produce the same physiological effect. The researchers believed this distinction was important. The increased activation seemed to arise from the effort of holding back a strong emotional response that the body was trying to express. And suppressing the outward expression did not eliminate the emotion itself. Suppression had only modest effects on their subjective emotional experience overall. So in other words, they could make themselves look less emotional, but they couldn't make themselves stop feeling the emotion. That helps us understand why staying positive on the outside is not necessarily the same thing as resolving what is happening on the inside. You can stop the tears, keep your voice steady, smile for everyone around you, and appear completely composed while your nervous system is still doing the work of containing what you feel. Now, there are times when temporarily controlling emotional expression is necessary. You may need to hold yourself together long enough to finish an appointment, drive home safely, take care of your child, or have a difficult conversation. But the concern is when "I cannot deal with this right now" becomes "I can never deal with this." You can become very skilled at looking fine while the emotion underneath remains unresolved. Now, the experiment we just discussed looked at what happens over a matter of minutes when someone feels an emotion and deliberately tries not to show it. But for many people, emotional suppression is not something they do for 10 minutes in a laboratory. It is a pattern they have practiced for years. I sometimes picture the act of trying to suppress an emotion like trying to hold a beach ball underneath the surface of the water. If you've ever tried to do that, you know how hard it is. You can do it, but it requires a lot of effort. The ball continually wants to rise, so some part of you has to keep pushing it back down. Now imagine becoming so practiced at holding that beach ball underwater that you barely realize you're doing it anymore. You tell yourself you're fine and you don't feel angry. You don't think you're stressed. Nothing seems to bother you. But meanwhile, you are clenching your jaw, sleeping poorly, bracing your shoulders, holding your breath, becoming irritable with people you love, or feeling chronically exhausted without connecting any of it to what you are carrying emotionally. But continually inhibiting emotions requires significant work from the body. In one study, Pennebaker and researchers Janice Keocolt-Glaser and Ronald Glaser randomly assigned 50 healthy college students to write for 20 minutes on 4 consecutive days. One group wrote about ordinary, emotionally neutral subjects. The other group wrote about some of the most traumatic and upsetting experiences of their lives, including thoughts and feelings they had often held back from other people. The researchers took blood before the experiment, immediately afterward, and again 6 weeks later. They were particularly interested in the response of T lymphocytes, white blood cells that play important roles in immune defense. The students who wrote about their traumatic experiences showed a greater response on a measure of T cell function than the control group, and the people who disclosed experiences that they had been particularly reluctant to discuss showed some of the strongest immune changes. They also made fewer visits to the student health center in the months that followed afterwards. It had long-term effects that provided a tremendous amount of benefit to their immune systems. And researchers have even explored this in people already living with chronic inflammatory illness. In a randomized study involving 112 people with either asthma or rheumatoid arthritis, participants spent 20 minutes on 3 consecutive days either writing about the most stressful experience of their lives or writing about emotionally neutral subjects. 4 months later, the rheumatoid arthritis patients who had written about stressful experiences showed a measurable improvement in disease activity. Across the experimental group, 47% of participants had experienced clinically meaningful improvement, compared with only 24% of the control group. And there is longer-term observational research worth mentioning. In one study, researchers assessed emotional suppression in 729 American adults and then followed mortality records for 12 years. After accounting for age, sex, education, and race, people with higher levels of emotional suppression had a greater risk of dying during the follow-up period. The association was especially notable for cancer mortality. Now, there is another side to this conversation because allowing an emotion does not mean feeding it indefinitely. Processing an emotion and ruminating on it can feel very similar from the inside because both involve thinking about something painful, but they tend to move in different directions. Processing creates movement of the emotion. You recognized what happened and how you feel about it. You may cry, journal, pray, talk with someone, recognize a boundary that needs to change, make a decision, or finally put language around something you have carried for years. Eventually, something shifts. You may still be sad or angry, but the intensity of the emotion begins to change. Rumination, on the other hand, circles without resolution. You replay the doctor's words over and over again. You revisit a frightening statistic. You rehearse what someone did to you and what you wish you had said. You ask the same question repeatedly without arriving anywhere new. The event may be over, but the mind continues placing the body back inside of it. Researchers have found evidence that this repetitive style of thinking can affect physiological recovery after stress. In one study involving adolescents who completed a standardized social stress test, greater rumination among those with depression was associated with slower cortisol recovery afterwards, while distraction and problem solving were associated with faster recovery. Now, thinking about a difficult experience is not harmful. The concern is repeated activation without resolution, when the body continues responding to the same injury again and again. So the goal is not to suppress the feeling, but it is to allow the feeling to move. Now, you do not need to become an expert in emotional processing to begin making room for difficult feelings. You simply need a way to approach them that is honest, safe, and capable of moving somewhere. So the first step is to tell the truth about what you feel. Ask yourself what is actually happening. Are you frightened, angry, grieving, lonely, ashamed, disappointed, overwhelmed? Do you feel betrayed by someone? Do you feel betrayed by your own body? Then notice how that emotion shows up physically. Maybe your chest feels tight, your stomach clenches, your jaw is tense, or you have been holding back tears all morning. You don't have to fix anything yet. Just begin with an honest sentence such as, I am really scared about tomorrow's scan, or I am furious that this is happening. Naming an emotion gives you something real to work with, whereas I need to stop being negative does not. Secondly, give the emotion a safe place to be experienced. Once you know what you are feeling, give it somewhere to go. You might journal about it, pray, talk with someone you trust, cry, take a walk, work with a therapist, or write a letter you never intend to send. Like D, you may even decide to approach one specific fear directly rather than waiting for it to ambush you every day. You can ask yourself, what am I afraid will happen? What does this fear make me want to avoid? What would I say if I stopped trying to sound brave for 5 minutes? Naming and labeling emotions dampens activity in the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, while simultaneously increasing activity in the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. This prefrontal recruitment inhibits emotional reactivity, effectively turning down the volume on negative feelings. Labeling and naming an emotion not only regulates your immediate amygdala response, but also engages the hippocampus to contextualize and structure the emotional memory. This can help reduce the physiological action of negative emotions in our body. The third thing you can do is ask whether the emotion is pointing you towards something you can take action on, because emotions often contain useful information. Fear may be telling you you need more information before making a medical decision. Anger may be telling you that someone crossed a boundary. Grief may be asking you to acknowledge something you genuinely lost. And loneliness may be telling you that you need more connection. Shame points towards something that needs more self-forgiveness. So ask yourself, is there anything here that requires action? And if there is, take the opportunity to follow up on it. The fourth thing you can do is learn to recognize when processing has become rumination. When you have spent some time with an emotion, ask yourself a simple question. Am I discovering anything new? If you understand the situation more clearly, have reached a decision, recognized something you needed, cried and felt some relief, or noticed the emotional intensity reducing, the process is helping those emotions move. If you are replaying the same exact conversation for the 20th time, becoming increasingly agitated, and arriving back at precisely the same place, you have probably shifted into rumination. And at that point, continuing to think harder is unlikely to solve the problem. Change the internal channel. Take a walk, go outside, move your body if you can, pray, call someone, take a shower, listen to music, work on something with your hands. Then bring your attention back to the present and ask, what do I need now, or what can I do from here? You are not suppressing the emotion by doing this. You've already given it your attention. You're just choosing not to spend the rest of the day feeding it. The final step you can take brings us back to part 1 of this series. Once you have allowed a difficult emotion some honest space, deliberately give yourself over to a joyful experience. You might cry and then sit outside in the sunshine. You might write an angry letter and then call someone who makes you laugh or watch a comedy. You might spend 20 minutes talking honestly about your fear and then make dinner with your family. You might grieve what your body cannot do anymore and then thank it for something it still did for you today. That is not covering up pain with positivity. The pain has been allowed to exist. Now you are making sure it's not the only thing that exists. You don't need to stay positive 24/7 to heal. You just need the freedom to move through the full emotional experience of being human without getting permanently trapped inside any one part of it. If you have not listened to part 1 of this series, Why Joy Belongs in Your Healing Plan, What 5 Minutes a Day Can Do, I encourage you to listen to that episode next. Together, these 2 conversations give us a much fuller picture of what emotional healing can look like. And if you would like more support between episodes, I would love to invite you to join my email newsletter. Each week, I share practical healing tools, reflections from the podcast, and encouragement for your healing journey. You can sign up through my website, therenegadenutritionist.com. Follow Renegade Remission and share this episode with someone who needs it. And as always, go be renegades.